members of your delegation, Kenya government officials, distinguished guests, I take this opportunity to welcome my brother, Your Excellency, and your delegation to Kenya. On behalf of the government and people of Kenya, please, by all means, feel at home while you are away from Singapore. Your Excellency, I know that COVID-19 delayed your visit to Kenya as originally scheduled, but I thank you for making this very first visit to Kenya. Kenya is happy and proud to host you, and your presence is a strong gesture of the friendship between our two people and Kenya and Singapore. The Prime Minister and I have had a fruitful engagement during which we discussed how we can work together with Singapore to develop a mutually beneficial strategic partnership in a dynamic and very competitive global marketplace. We have agreed to develop a long-term strategic partnership between our two countries anchored on many sectors of our mutually beneficial relationship. We have discussed the potential of the Nairobi International Financial Center serving sub-Saharan Africa, particularly Eastern and Central Africa region, especially on matters green financing, and Singapore's successful experience and best practices is an asset to us on this particular venture. I have noted also that Enterprise Singapore has already opened offices in Nairobi, and I have committed to Prime Minister that the government of Kenya is going to work with Enterprise Singapore to make sure that they have what it takes to build the necessary networks and partnerships between private sector companies in Kenya, private sector companies in Singapore, and to ensure that we exploit the full potential of trade, business, and investment between our two countries. Digitization of the economy and government services in all sectors is an enabler for our bottom-up economic transformation agenda. We want to run an efficient and paperless economy and society. A collaboration between Kenya and Singapore, who have a history of innovation, is key, hence the inclusion of the ICT sector in our strategic partnership between our two countries. I am happy to inform you that His Excellency Long and I witnessed the signing of 3 memoranda of understanding on ICT, which will facilitate cooperation on cybersecurity, digitization of government services, ICT capacity building, among the other areas. We also signed another MOU on skills development to facilitate collaboration in human resource capacity building for civil servants and students, particularly in specific areas that need to support a sustainable socio-economic development priorities, especially the ones we have identified in Kenya. As we all understand, the Tibet space is the engine for providing the human capital necessary to assist us in driving our Vision 2030 and our economic development blueprint as a government. We have also agreed that the bilateral investment treaty signed between our two nations on 12th June 2018 be immediately operationalized. We further directed our respective ministers to conclude negotiations on avoidance of double taxation within the shortest time possible. And we believe this will spark and grow trade and investment opportunities between Kenya and Singapore. We have also agreed to actively explore methods of acquiring knowledge and support from Singapore's highly prosperous housing model. Kenyans are currently engaged in the housing debate, with approximately 6.5 million Kenyans lacking affordable and decent housing. Singapore has one of the most successful stories on matters of public housing. The Prime Minister has informed me that 85% of all Singaporeans live in decent, affordable public housing. Their story and journey did not start overnight. It began 60 years ago, around the same time we established our housing policy in Kenya. They took some hard decisions and made some sacrifices where they undertook mandatory savings, and the results are there for everyone to see. We are 60 years late in taking this bold step. As a result, our country is infamous for having some of the largest informal settlements that number in excess of 1,140 slums. I don't want us to postpone this agenda anymore, and thus I am asking Kenyans to make the choice by saving into the housing fund so that 60 years from now, we can also have a similar success story to tell. We have invited Singaporeans' private sector to consider investment opportunities in our transport and logistics sectors. We've also explored the potential of Singapore becoming a gateway for Kenya's agricultural products to the ASEAN region. The Prime Minister and I share the view that climate change represents the greatest existential threat to the survival of mankind, and collective and cooperative action by all governments is of utmost importance. It is for this reason that I shared the objectives of the forthcoming Africa Climate Summit, which Kenya will host in September this year. The summit will cohere a common African position for COP28, including an articulation of climate finance and climate investment solutions for climate change action. This will propel the continent from a passive victim to an active participant in climate change solutions. Prime Minister Long has expressed his support for us having concurrent positions on matters climate change, because they, as well as us, face the same threat in equal measure. On this urgent issue of climate change, our ministers have signed an MOU on carbon credit collaboration, which provides a framework for the trading of carbon credits between our two countries in line with the stipulation of the Paris Agreement. The agreement also provides for the exchange of information, knowledge, best practices, and capacity building on carbon credits, plus collaboration on projects which will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Prime Minister Long and I also agreed on the urgent need to reform both the global peace and security infrastructure, as well as the multilateral financial architecture, to ensure that these institutions are equitable, fair, and fit for purpose in responding to multifaceted global challenges. Kenya and Singapore will continue to work closely on areas of mutual interest, and we have shared with His Excellency Prime Minister Kenya's contribution to regional peace initiatives. Additionally, I shared Kenya's position on the need to reform the UN Security Council to make it much more inclusive and reflective of the current global order and dynamics. It is important for like-minded countries like Kenya and Singapore to support common positions. On the status of the UN office in Nairobi, Prime Minister Long and I agreed that the renovation and expansion of facilities to match other UN offices globally is a welcome development. The upgraded facility will accommodate at least 9,000 conference delegates at any meeting, and Singapore will work with us, especially in the upcoming UN Assembly, where discussions on these facilities' improvement will be held at the UN in New York. In conclusion, Prime Minister Long and I committed to having an annual high-level meeting consultation on our collaboration in financial services and ICT sectors. The financial sectors will focus on climate financing, while ICT will center on digitization of the economy, including raising the capacity of micro, small, and medium enterprises to make them much more efficient and incorporate them into the formal economy. These core areas form the basis of our strategic partnership for the benefit of the people of Singapore and the people of Kenya. Your Excellency, once again, on behalf of the people of Kenya, I am truly grateful that you found time to visit us, and I have responded to your request that early next year, by God's grace, I will make a visit to Singapore. Thank you very much and welcome.
President William Ruto, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to everybody.
Good afternoon.
I thank President Ruto for his warm hospitality and his warm words. This is my first official visit to Kenya, and I'm delighted to be here today. Despite being geographically quite distant, Singapore and Kenya have similar outlooks. Our peoples share similar aspirations, such as inclusive growth, a high standard of living, ethnic and religious harmony, and good housing, healthcare, education. We share similar views on the challenges faced by the Global South. We both worry about growing geopolitical tensions, rising protectionism, threats to the multilateral trading system, inflation, pandemics, and climate change. We agreed that it was important that countries continue to work towards building linkages in the digital economy, cooperating on food, energy security, and sustainable development. The President and I reaffirmed the warm and long-standing relations between Singapore and Kenya. 2 years ago, we celebrated our 30th anniversary of diplomatic relations, and our two countries cooperate and exchange experiences in areas such as governance, public service administration, urban planning, and livable cities. Our economic cooperation has been growing. Kenya is one of Singapore's important trading partners in sub-Saharan Africa. Despite COVID, bilateral trade in 2021 increased by almost a quarter year on year. Several Singapore companies are operating in Kenya in a variety of sectors: shipping, logistics and port management systems, agribusiness, hospitality and fintech solutions, amongst others. A delegation of Singapore companies is in Nairobi. They came with me to pursue opportunities for investments and partnerships with Kenyan companies. Our two countries also collaborate well in multilateral fora. President Ruto and I reaffirmed our shared commitment to multilateralism and a rules-based global order. Singapore and Kenya agreed to continue our cooperation at the UN and other multilateral co-organizations, and to cooperate on UN reform to enhance its effectiveness. We discussed new areas of cooperation, first on information and communication technologies. We just signed an MOU in this area, which will allow both sides to exchange best practices and knowledge in ICT and promote talent development and innovations. The MOU will also facilitate and strengthen strategic cooperation in cybersecurity. Secondly, on climate change, we signed an MOU in carbon credits collaboration under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and this will encourage, develop, and facilitate collaborative carbon credit projects of mutual interest. International collaboration, such as this agreement between Singapore and Kenya, is critical to promoting global climate action to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. Third, on human capital development. Both our countries placed heavy emphasis on nurturing talent. The MOU on skills development will encourage closer technical cooperation between both countries in areas such as leadership and governance, education, and digitalization. And this will take place through knowledge exchange, capacity building courses, and other cooperation. There is great potential to expand our bilateral cooperation. Kenya's strategic location serves as a gateway for Singapore companies into East Africa. Likewise, Singapore can serve as a gateway for Kenyan companies into Southeast Asia. I welcome the ratification of the Bilateral Investment Treaty and the President's commitment to settle the avoidance of the double taxation agreement between our two countries as soon as possible. These moves send a strong positive signal to businesses and provide clarity and assurance on the cross-border transactions and investment. I look forward to working with President Ruto and his government to bring our bilateral relations to even greater heights. I'm very happy that the President has accepted my invitation to visit Singapore, and I look forward to receiving him before too long, and if all goes well, early next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellencies. We have a few questions from the journalists. Kindly identify yourself and who you are addressing the question to. Thank you. And the media house you represent.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister, President Ruto. I'm Geraldine from CNA. I would like to ask what you think Kenya's value is to Singapore in terms of not just business and trade, but also expanding Singapore's diplomacy in Africa.
Well, economics is, of course, a very important part of any two countries' relations, and between Singapore and Kenya, as I explained, we have good economic ties and they are growing. But Kenya is also a very important country in Africa. In East Africa particularly, it has a key role, not just as the hub and as a base from which we can extend our reach to the rest of East Africa, but also a role in the region's security and stability. And Singapore has goodwill in Africa and in Kenya. We have many friends here. It goes back a long way. In fact, in 1964, when we were in Malaysia, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew visited Africa on a tour, and Kenya was one of the countries which he came to, and he called on President Jomo Kenyatta. And we've maintained those ties since, and it is important to Singapore that we cultivate friends and partners all over the world, because in the global scheme of things, we are all quite small countries, and small countries need to make common cause with one another on issues which concern us all, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's climate change, whether it's nuclear non-proliferation, or the sanctity of the UN Charter and the inviolability of international borders, which was what was at stake when Russia invaded Ukraine. And therefore, it's important for me to visit Kenya and to be in Africa and to show that this is important to us and that we would like to develop our relations with our friends further.
Okay. Next question.
Prime Minister Lee and President William Ruto, I'm Sydney Chazima from NTV. My question goes to the seemingly trade imbalance between Kenya and Singapore, in that Kenya exports around $10 million to Singapore, and Kenya imports around 130-something million US dollars. Is there any sort of agreement between the two countries to bridge that gap? Thank you.
We have not focused on this. We want to expand our economic relationship. We would like to develop the trade. And we want both Kenya's exports to Singapore and Singapore's exports to Kenya to grow. I think whether it's $10 million or $190 million is both still relatively small and very small compared to what it could be and what we should make them. And I think our focus should be to grow the trade and to do it in a way which Kenyan companies can benefit and Kenyan consumers can benefit. And likewise in Singapore, Singapore companies see new business opportunities and Singapore consumers see new sources of fruit, vegetables, tourism, flowers, so many things which Kenya provides.
I agree with Prime Minister Lee. Part of the agreements that we have signed today, whether it's the bilateral investment treaty and what we are working on the avoidance of double taxation, are part of the instruments that we will leverage on to encourage the private sector investment and trade between our two countries, so that what Prime Minister Lee rightfully describes as very low trade volumes, we can be able to scale our trade, scale our investment, and begin the journey to leverage the imbalance between our trade. And secondly, it is a clear signal to us in Kenya that we need to do more about our exports. As we are all aware, our exports as a percentage of GDP came down from 28% to 10%. It is the reason why we are expanding our county industrial and aggregation centers. It is the reason why we will have new 5 export promotion zones in the Republic of Kenya, because exports as a percentage of GDP is even reflected in the trade between us and Singapore. There is scale, there is scope for us to export more, not just into Singapore, but to the rest of the world. But value addition and agro-processing will play a big part of our ability to be able to export. And that is why the bottom-up economic transformation agenda is focused on ensuring that we build the necessary capacity for us to do value addition and for us to engage in agro-processing, so that our flowers, our coffee, our tea, our avocados can find their way into Singapore. And I want to thank Prime Minister Lee for agreeing that Singapore can be the gateway into the Southeast Asia and the whole of that region. So we are building the necessary blocks on our side, and we are building the necessary ecosystem together with Singapore to facilitate increase in trade.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister Lee and President Ruto. This is Ke Yang from Lianhe Zaobao, Singapore. I have a question on the new areas of collaboration between the two countries, and in particular on climate action. With an MOU inked earlier on carbon credit. Would you like to comment how will the two countries actually move forward and on issues that face the mankind, both on bilateral and multilateral forums, and what is your vision of what can be achieved by the two countries? Thank you.
The MOU expresses our intention to collaborate and for Singapore to take advantage of carbon credits which Kenya will be able to provide. Carbon credits which are compliant with Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and which therefore can be used to fulfill our nationally determined contributions, NDCs. In other words, what we have committed to reduce our carbon footprint, some part of that we can fulfill through compliant carbon credits, and Kenya is producing such carbon credits. We need such carbon credits, and therefore we would like to work together on that. And the MOU expresses our intention to conclude an agreement to work together on that. Climate change is a very serious problem for the whole world. In Singapore, we see warmer weather. You may think it's just a blip, but actually it's a long-term trend, and it's going to accentuate. In Africa, in Kenya, we also see extremes of weather, extremes of drought and of floods. And it's existential because human beings, cattle, wildlife, all are threatened when the climate gets extreme. And therefore, countries have to work together in order to reduce global emissions of carbon in order to reduce global warming and slow down the process of change, of climate change, so that countries and mankind have got time to adapt. And we want to work closely with Kenya and many other countries in order to do that.
I think precisely what Prime Minister Lee has said, that if there is one phenomena that is urgent and that poses an existential threat to humanity, it is climate change. And the MOU we have signed today speaks to some of the solutions that will inform our action towards solving global warming and every country meeting their nationally determined contributions. We are changing the conversation from one of finger pointing and blame game, and we are moving it away from who caused what. We are having a conversation about climate financing, about climate investment. How do we work together to ensure that we support Singapore to meet their nationally determined contribution, but in the process, they too help Kenya to manage the extreme situations that come with climate change in our region. So the carbon trading market is an answer to climate financing and climate investment. And that is the new paradigm, and that is the new space that Singapore and Kenya are leading. Just for the record, 25% of all carbon trading going on in Africa today happens in Kenya. So we are already a leader in the space of carbon trading. And the partnership that we're going to build with Singapore is not only going to speak to scaling up our carbon trading, because I already announced that our next biggest export from Kenya will be carbon credits. We are concluding the legislation around that particular aspect in the next month or so. I will be speaking to members of parliament to explain to them the opportunity that exists for our country in the space of carbon trading, so that we can work with countries like Singapore and others in the space of carbon credit and carbon trading. So that's the new language for the future, especially in the context of climate change.
President William Ruto and Prime Minister Lee, my name is Chemutai Goin from Citizen TV, and my question goes to Prime Minister Lee. Kenya and Singapore were almost at par many years ago. 60 years later, while strides have been made in Kenya in dealing with the issues of ignorance, health, but there's still work to be done. What was the magic bullet that Singapore instituted to make the strides it has made and lessons that Kenya can pick? Thank you.
I don't think there is a magic bullet. I think it depends on circumstances, on the history, as well as on the environment which you find yourselves in, and what you're able to mobilize from the population in response. We are a very small country. The land area is very small, 700 square kilometers. The population is very small. At the time we became independent, 1.5 million, now less than 6 million people, and surrounded by countries much bigger than us, and needing to make a living, do or die. No resources, no natural endowments, no inherited wealth. And that generation of people decided that they would make a go of it, and we, their children and grandchildren, are the beneficiaries who have tried to continue to make a success of it. And fortunately for us, our forefathers' efforts worked, and our economy took off. and Singapore has been able to earn a living for itself. I think every country has got a different path, every country has got different challenges, every country deals with them in its own way, and Singapore hopes to work with them, win-win, mutually beneficially, to help them to progress and to be part of one stable world where we can live in peace with one another and human beings can fulfill the human spirit.
I think Prime Minister Lee is being modest. I think they made many correct decisions, which as Kenyans we can benefit from learning. And they are less endowed than us. They have less much of a country than we do. They have a smaller market than we do. So we have most things better than them. But they are better than us because they made the right decisions. I think my invitation and your response, Prime Minister, coming to Kenya, just by coming alone is a testimony for us to read how a country so small, how a country with no endowments, how a country with no natural resources, how a country that was not rich at all and had no inheritance made a success of itself by making the right decisions. If there is one lesson we will learn from you as Kenyans, is to make the right decisions, however difficult they may be, because we can see in Singapore what right decisions can make of a country.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The Excellencies will now proceed for a luncheon.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
The respective delegations will be guided shortly.